She has been invited to speak later this week at the 50th anniversary celebration of the United Nations at the United Nations, where she will give a presentation on her ancestor, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, as well as the National Council of Women. She is here tonight with her husband, Paul, and she has 2 adult sons. And please welcome her.
Well, thank you very much. I'm so excited to see you all here. And the first question I would like to ask is, I'm wondering how many of you am I related to, the Millers and the Phillips? Can I see a show of hands? I already know some of my family. Anyone else related to the Phillips?
Any Parks
Great.
in your family?
Could be. I think I'm related to just about every family in the town. But anyway, it's just lovely to see you all here. And I enjoyed so much Susan's presentation. It was quite thrilling for me to hear a professor of women's history studies validate the importance of publishing this book. And I am just thrilled with her words, and I certainly look forward to further communication with her. So I'm absolutely pleased that you have invited me here to speak to you, the members and guests of the Lackawanna Historical Society. But many of my writer friends have told me that every good writer has to begin their talk with a story about themselves and about the writing of the book. So I think one of the things that I experienced that I found particularly perplexing, I wanted to share with you. And it was about 2 weeks before my book was due to go off to the printer. I was in big trouble. While preparing it for publication, I was also learning how to use my computer software and formatting and stylization. I couldn't get the pagination correctly, and I was frantically searching the program book to find out exactly what I should be doing. And the guidebook makes the assumption that one that is using that guidebook has already had some experience with the computer, so certain basic steps are overlooked. Well, I followed it to the letter of the best of my ability and got into deeper trouble. And after about a week of trying to extricate myself from that, I gave in and I called the emergency helpline that was listed. My call was answered by a person that sounded like a male teenager who listened to my problem and with weary patience questioned my process. And when I explained what I had done and told him that I had followed the book to the letter, he firmly told me it was totally wrong and to follow his instructions. Well, when I asked him, how is it possible that it was wrong? This is what the book says. I'm doing exactly what they said. In a tone of voice reserved undoubtedly only for female middle-aged computer novices, he said to me, "Now, Jacqueline, you listen to me. You throw the book away. You listen to me. Don't you pay any attention to it. Destroy it. Do you understand me? Do exactly what I'm saying to you. Do you understand?" And I meekly said, "Yes, I do," and told him that I would follow his advice to the letter. He, of course, knew better than I. Well, by the time I finished making the changes, I was totally exhausted and decided it was enough for one day and I would start the next using his format. So as I began doing only what he told me to do, I found myself again in deep trouble. Yes, that's right, he gave me wrong advice. So I spent another week of telephone conversations before the mess was corrected, but I was able to meet my deadline. So the moral of it is that we must all continue to learn to trust ourselves to get us to the frontier, be it Ohio or the land of computers. But on a serious note, I told my writer friends that there certainly was really nothing funny about this book. There was certainly nothing funny about her experiences, and that the rarity of finding such a collection of letters that span a 20-year period in a woman's life from her arrival in Ohio to her death in Ohio has been confirmed by several historians with whom I have been in contact. The letters are a wonderful description of life on the frontier, its sadness and its tribulations, and is the story of Mary Phillips Lott, her husband Henry, and Mary's brother Thomas. And since Mary's grave is unknown, I feel that my book marks Mary's memory and place in history. It also shows what is common among women from the period, and that is that documentation of Mary's life on earth, with the exception of these letters, is just about non-existent. The difficulty in researching women's lives and the scarcity of locating records tells the common story of women's history, and that is why it really is lacking in depth. That is why a book such as this is so important, to let people know exactly what women experienced. So it was necessary. It was absolutely necessary to get this book published so that one woman's history could be preserved. The quote from Mary's letters that I use in the front of the book says, "Once more I lift my pen to let you know that through the mercy of Him that never sleeps nor slumbers, we are all alive and in common health." She expresses this fact throughout her letters, her gratitude to be in common health and the faith that sustained her. And what I'd like to share with you this evening are some of the events mentioned in the letters by Mary, and I will relate them to some of the circumstances of women as well as the shared views of frontier women of that period, 1826 by 1846. But I will begin by telling you a little of the background of Mary and John, since I'm sure there are many of you that are not familiar with their story. John Phillips, Deacon John Phillips, was born in 1752, and he is my Revolutionary War grandfather. Mary, born about 1782, and they were brother and sister by the same father, Francis Phillips, but probably by different mothers. It is presumed that John's mother, Demis Aylesworth, died when John was about 14 years old, since he is mentioned in his grandfather Aylesworth's will, but his mother is not. And because of the disparate differences in the siblings' ages, it's believed that Francis, John's father, who was born in West Greenwich, Rhode Island in 1720, was married twice and probably 3 times. There is also a Bible record that exists showing 4 other sons, Zacharias or Zacharias, and Francis, whom I believe I located in New York State as late as 1825, 1830. Brother Thomas, who apparently went with Mary Lott to Ohio, first in New York State, and then Cornwell, the youngest, who I also found on a New York state census with wife and children, and who probably died somewhere between 1843 and 1846, since one letter from Mary is written to his wife, which indicates that by this point she was alone in Pennsylvania. John was 30 years old when Mary was born, and Mary's father was 62 years old. And this is a fact quite common for the period. Today, this is considered very unusual and was not during that period. Also common was the fact of women giving birth certainly into their 40s and well into their 50s. Francis Phillips, John's father, was a member of the Connecticut Land Company. It was a company that was formed to purchase land in Pennsylvania. And I have located Francis Phillips as early as 1771 in Pennsylvania, when the Wyoming Valley was called the Westmoreland County of the state of Connecticut. And it would be many years of bitter conflict between the Yankees and William Penn's people before ownership of all of the land in this region could be documented and proven. John's claims, however, John Phillips' claims were well documented, and his land ownership was approved by about 1791. It was a long time that they had to wait for this, because he was here during the Revolution and had land then. So you can see it was many years before that took place. However, I found no further proof of claims by Francis Phillips. Now, John and Mary were separated, a fact that's referred to often in her letters, probably after the death of their father, Francis, somewhere between 1788 and 1791. That is documented by land records that refer to him as being now deceased. His son, John, served from 3 states during the Revolutionary War: New York, Vermont, and Pennsylvania. And he did go on to become what was considered a very wealthy landowner and owned thousands of acres in the region between Scranton and Wilkes-Barre. He was a deacon in the First Baptist Church, and he gave very generous gifts of land to his children and to his grandchildren. Old Deacon John lived to the age of 94 years and 8 months. He was married 3 times, the 3rd time at the age of 90 years old. He had 6 children and 88 grandchildren and uncounted great-grandchildren at his death in 1846. So that's why I know I'm related to everybody in this area after all of those grandchildren. And there's many families in the area who are related to John, including the Millers, the Tripps, the Farrs, the Wilsons, the Russells, the Wilcoxes, the Hewitts. It goes on and on. I'm descended through the Miller line. His daughter, Suzanne Phillips, married Samuel Miller. So this is how the Millers started. My father died 2 years ago at the age of 86, and his father lived till almost 91. So there is the longevity which exists there. Well, when I came to Scranton to explore the Miller-Phillips line, this was a very interesting treasure hunt, and this historical society is absolutely wonderful and a joy to come to and to deal with. I do feel we have friends here. And it was when I arrived, I'd had some correspondence with Mary Ann about the Phillips line, and she would always refer to me, would tell me about the collection of Hilda Phillips Brown. But I had no idea what I was going to find until my husband and I arrived in Scranton and set upon the table in the back room were cartons and cartons filled, overflowing with papers from the collection of Hilda Phillips Brown. This woman was extraordinary. She started her search many, many years ago, over a 25 to 30 year period, right up until the time of her death in about 1962. And Hilda Phillips Brown was a very conservative lady in terms of saving things. Her notes were kept on envelopes, old shopping lists, backs of bills. I mean, it was amazing to go through this. Well, so there in the bottom of this box were these letters. And Mary Ann had also mentioned that to me at one point, and I really had no concept of what this was going to be. And at the bottom of this box was a collection of letters copied from the originals. We do not know where the originals exist, but Hilda had the originals by 1968. They are referred to in an article written by the Abington Journal. But what Hilda had done was she had painstakingly hand-copied each and every one of these letters on long pieces of shelf paper to use that as a tool to further her investigation of the genealogy of the Phillips and the Miller line. And they were just reams and reams and reams of paper, all of these letters, just kind of one after another. She had copied them the way Mary Lott had written them, no punctuation, no capitalizations, misspellings, and so forth. So she had used them as a working guide in doing her search. So through clues in her letters, I tracked Mary Lott and her husband Henry Lott to Genesee County, New York, in an area, interestingly enough, not far from my hometown of Buffalo. I had no idea, of course, when I lived in Buffalo that she even existed, and I found it interesting and very serendipitous that she had actually lived just a few miles from where I was raised. And as Susan had mentioned the fact, she had talked about John Smith being located in that region. And I have wondered whether there might have been some connection. I wondered, were they followers of, Joseph Smith, were they followers of hers? Were they possible early followers of the Mormon Church? And there's nothing in the letters to refer to that. Maybe it was just an interesting circumstance, but the paths seem to cross one another. However, I was not able to locate any documents in the state of New York that confirmed that Henry and Mary Lott lived there. Part of the Lott family remained in Wyoming County, Pennsylvania, while others already had moved to Delaware County, Ohio, with Henry's father, Zephaniah Lott. And Zephaniah was a Revolutionary War veteran who went to Ohio, as did many Pennsylvanians, to obtain land available to veterans of the Revolutionary War. So there's many Pennsylvania families there. Many towns have names the same as towns in this area, Kingston and so forth. There's a wide number of them. So I did find several documents on file in Delaware County, Ohio, to show their residence. However, it is only in the letters that the full story is told of their existence. And her letters begin upon their arrival in Ohio, in which she describes a frontier existence no different from that of the men in her life. She was equal partner in the hardships and drudgeries of everyday activities, and often was expected to go far beyond what we may think of as her fair share of the load. But she did appear to be a true partner of her husband Henry, and in many examples in her letters she appears to be the decision maker. Now, this is a circumstance shared by many frontier women. Necessity provided the need for women to be self-sustaining and independent. This was a very important first for women. Her first letter is dated October 8th, 1826. And by the way, we do know that letters are missing. There are gaps in the dates. So I often would wonder what are in those letters that I don't have that would fill in these gaps. And we may never know. But fortunately, we do have the first letter dated October 8th, 1826. And Mary gives many details in that letter, which really doesn't tell the whole story of her journey. And she says, "We came from Buffalo, New York, to Portland, Ohio, on the steamboat. Had good luck, was 2 days and 2 nights on water, but we had a very tedious journey from there in consequence of rain and new roads. We found it about 100 miles. The fact of the matter, however, was that life's rules of conduct were quite controlled in those days, particularly for women. And what she does not make reference to is that in the 1820s, new transportation modes, such as steamboats, caused new expectations of behavior. There were various attempts to segregate the sexes, both on board these steamships and in waiting rooms. While traveling on a steamboat, an English woman writer of the period describes the men's cabin on the boat as the more desirable, and says, "Their exclusive right to it is somewhat uncourteously insisted upon." She also described the fact that husbands and wives were separated throughout the entire journey and could only be together at meal times. We can assume that Mary, her husband, and brother had to comply with these rules as well. She goes on to describe their difficult Ohio beginnings by saying quite simply, "We have bought 50 acres of entirely new land joining Leonard's," this is Henry's brother, "got 2 log rooms raised, the bigness of our old rooms at Stafford, a town in Genesee County, New York." However, in another letter, Mary refers to the financial difficulties when she says, "There was $54 behind on our place we did not get, I think in consequence of not taking my advice. The man came for the deed, and I told Henry not to give it up till he got the money, but the man said he should have it the next day. We waited 2 weeks, could not get it, had to come away suing the note and leaving the business with Anson Williams." Women were normally excluded from business decisions, but it is obvious that Mary had a better sense for business arrangements than Henry, because at today's value, that $54 they were owed was worth at least $10,000. Now, Mary was probably born about 1782 in the Wyoming Valley in Pennsylvania, while it was also the frontier to where her father, Francis, had emigrated from Rhode Island. When he died, as I said earlier, we know it was no later than 1791 and probably more like 1788. English and colonial law still influenced life of the period. So after a husband's death, a widow was not allowed to be guardian to her own children after they reached a certain age if ownership of property was involved. By law, the mother was not allowed to oversee it. Also, the death of a husband often necessitated selling the homestead to pay off his debts, another obligation required by law. A mother might then be forced to send children to other families as bondservants if she could not afford to keep them. And in these instances, therefore, a guardian would be appointed by the court, or could also be selected by the child. And in Mary's case, there is a record in the probate records of Luzerne County, Pennsylvania, in about 1796, in which she was described as a minor over the age of 14. I wanted to also refer to the fact that at that period of time, particularly going on into an unknown frontier, sickness and health problems certainly overpowered and predominated family life, but necessity forced the women to not only to be the caretakers, but also to overlook their own needs and illnesses. And Mary makes reference to that in her letters, when she says in a letter of February 1827, "My health continued much the same it was when I wrote you a few days after we moved, when I was taken very poorly, and have been so ever since. I have every complaint a woman can have of my age besides a broken constitution. Yet I have not been entirely confined, but I have had to work every moment I could for something to live on, as our money was gone last fall." And another reference, again, is to the fact that we are at present all in common health. I have been very unwell with a disorder that has prevailed in this neighborhood. 'Twas something like a very bad cold, but I am better now. The widow Bartley died with it about 5 weeks ago. I think she might have lived had she have had care and things for her comfort in the first of her sickness, but help was afforded too late. I was sick at the time, and I did not get there quite a week before she died. But she died in the triumphs of a living faith and fondly committed her 4 little children in the hands of the Lord, saying she knew He would take better care of them than she could. It's not known where Mary spent her early years, but when discussing mutual family friends in a letter, Mary relates, "Abraham says the tender tie of friendship felt for me in childhood when I was separated from all relatives are yet the same. And although we have been separated so many years, yet he believes with you and me that time or distance can never break those tender ties of friendship." Her unhappy childhood is very obvious throughout her writings when Mary refers to herself as a child of sorrow. It is possible that Mary's mother remarried, and as was common, children may also have been sent to other family members or friends to take care of. Certainly separations were very common in that period. She says in another letter, "Often of late, with most solemn reflections, I recall my past life from my childhood till the present moment, the many separations of dear friends, some by death, and particular the moment my bosom heaves forth the big sigh, while tears gives vent to my almost bursting heart. But ere I am aware, Jesus appears and fills my soul with glory, and seems to say, I am still thy friend, through thorns and briars has always marked your way." Mary's strong religious faith is apparent certainly throughout her letters, as Susan pointed out. It's a faith that is verbalized in many other diaries and letters of frontier women. And it's interesting to note that after the American Revolution, church attendance decreased due to the new separation of church and state. With exceptions, it remained in decline throughout the country. However, during the first quarter of the 19th century, as Susan referred to the religious revival, churches made a concerted effort to widen membership. And finding that males were less influenced in daily life by religion than females, ministers recognized that faith was of immediate concern to women. And some scholars suggest that women, although accepting of men as church leaders, also quickly learned that there were few places outside the home where autonomy was allowed and accepted other than the church. Therefore, religion came to be accepted by the men as women's realm. To the women on the frontier, maintaining Protestantism was one of their greatest challenges. It satisfied their spiritual needs certainly as well and explained their daily lives. All things were the will of God. Evangelical revivals gave women the opportunity to take control of their own lives and to be given essential roles. Participation in camp meetings and revivals were often referred to as the feminization of religion, and they gave women the opportunity to become leaders and charismatic figures in their own right. But the most important aspect for women, as Susan also pointed out, was the socialization and feelings of security that they provided through the women's relationships with other women. Mary's interest and involvement with religion is expressed in one of her letters when she says, "The inhabitants appear very friendly and meetings are handy of almost all kinds, though no particular revivals of religion at present." In another letter, she says, "I have stayed home from meeting to let you know we are all in common health." In still another, she says, "It's almost meeting time, and I must omit some things I would have wrote, for I should have wrote finer had I not been in such haste." Historians say that the Presbyterian religion was among the best organized in Ohio. And Mary makes reference to that when she says, "The Presbyterians have had a protracted meeting, and it lasted almost 2 weeks, night and day. There was near 40 moved forward, and about 20 professed to obtain a hope in Jesus. May they ever stand fast in that liberty wherewith Christ has made them free." Now, in the 1830s, the issue of the abolition of slavery became a natural outgrowth of women's domestic and religious life and was a precursor to women's suffrage. Mary's brother John apparently had strong opinions regarding this matter, as did Mary, since in a letter dated 1838, Mary says, "We return you many thanks for your papers. We think them very good, and their opinion on slavery exactly with my mind. For ever since I come to years of understanding, I believe slavery a great evil and an abomination in the eyes of our Heavenly Father. And for such enmity to be suffered in a nation that has been so cried up for a land of liberty. And I do believe if something is not done soon to alleviate the sufferings of the poor slaves, that the Lord will deliver them as he did the children of Israel some way or another, and as a nation we shall be scourged. For the beautiful true liberty will no more flourish, for the limbs are already loped and the leaves are withering." I find that particularly beautiful, that paragraph. Communication with family and other women friends was very important, and the commonality of Mary's pleas for family to move to the frontier is seen in other examples of women's frontier writings. And if they couldn't get relatives to move to the frontier, then they were always making plans to go visit the family back at the old family home. But often these plans were not carried off, although she did at one point get to come back to Pennsylvania. But concerns about feminine appearance and proper clothing is also very prominent among these plans to visit home. And Mary shares her worries when she says, "I shall try very hard to come if we all have our health and can possibly get a little spending money and a few clothes that I think you will not be ashamed of me." And if family or friends couldn't come or visits couldn't be made back home, then women had faith that relatives and friends would come together in heaven. This belief sustained them, as it did Mary. And when after a disappointment of not being able to make a trip to Pennsylvania, she says, "My determination is to see you should the Lord spare our lives and health. And my prayer is that Jesus may be your best and dearest friend and support the tottering frames till we meet again in this life. But if not here, I fully believe we shall in heaven when this short voyage of life shall end." I wanted to read another letter in the book that expresses the tragedy of death and illness and the joy of rebirth all in one point. "Once more I sit down to let you know we are alive and in common health through the goodness of our Heavenly Father, though with sorrowful heart I have to inform you that our dear sister Hannah has been called to follow her daughter Lucina to the silent grave from whence no traveler e'er returned. She had not yet seen 18 years and had been married almost 3 years. She had a baby last September, but it died at 6 weeks old. She left no family but her husband. She was like the fair flower that fades before noon. The first cause of her illness was the chill and fever. A year last winter they moved out to the Sandusky Plains. She was taken very sick 2 years ago, but got better, so her father brought her home in one room before she was confined, where she lived and died. And she goes on to talk about her family and the children left behind. And Mary visited her in the beginning of her illness, and she said, "I talked with her and gained full satisfaction the last she talked in connection, though she spoke sentences till almost the last breath. She called her father and her mother and her brothers and sisters to the bed, and her other friends, and took them by the hand, talked to them one by one, giving them some token of her affection, and saying, 'Farewell, remember dying Lucina, and meet,' and has a grown family and is about to have another infant child." So these are the common sounds of the letters going from tragedy to happy events. Well, the poignancy of the life of frontier women is described by another writer who said that clinging to a few treasured heirlooms as reminders of a kinder life, they accompanied their husbands, suffering the most disparate physical hardships, as well as a desolating sense of loneliness. Mary's loneliness and despair becomes more apparent as the years pass, and at the end, she is without family members. After Mary's husband, Henry, died, as was the custom, an inventory of possessions was taken, and included, along with a description of farm implements and a short list of household items, were Mary's 2 spinning wheels, her loom, 2 Bibles, 6 other books, and incongruously 1 red fan. A memento from a happier time and place, perhaps. It evokes a vision of a young woman filled with hopes and dreams moving forward into the future. And although as we read her story, her trials and tribulations may fill us with sad recognition, her life of hardship was shared by many women who were carving a path in the wilderness for us to follow. Mary Lott died in 1846, a few months after the death of her brother John, and I believe she died when she received the news of John's death. She, throughout her letters, certainly refers to her fear that soon she will hear that he has died. But we should not think of Mary as a tragic symbol. Rather, she was a woman of strength, courage, and faith, and her life should be considered a proud tribute to all the women who went before and came after, clutching and cherishing their own red fans. Thank you very much.